All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending today's webinar on residential existing buildings for the 2024 IECC. This webinar is recorded and the recording is posted to the Code Adoption Toolkit on Colorado Energy Office's website. There's also a whole YouTube page of all of the previous recordings with a bunch of different trainings on there, so definitely check that out. Okay, so if there are any issues with audio today, feel free to write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello. I'm a senior project manager for Noresco. Today's training is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Shums Coda Associates. So thank you, Shums. All right, let me see here. On this next slide, you'll see some of the trainings that we have. We're getting towards the end of our webinar series of trainings that have been scheduled thus far, and hopefully we'll continue to pick up that in July as well. But on the docket, we've got garages and sunrooms, we've got existing buildings for commercial and residential roof assemblies. So definitely check those out. We hope to see you guys there. But Hope and I have been working with the Energy Office for years now to provide trainings just like this one. We've got this webinar series, but we also offer role-based trainings where it kind of looks through the eyes of energy code compliance through the eyes of the user. So if you're a plans examiner or a designer or an inspector, we have roles that take a deeper dive into the energy code and look at it from your perspective with activities, real life examples, trying to put the code into reality. So if you're interested in any of those trainings, or if you're a jurisdiction that is looking at code adoption for the 2021 or 2024 suite of codes, the Colorado Energy Office is here to help. We provide technical assistance, and it ranges from helping you write your code language to attending city council meetings or stakeholder engagement sessions. Whatever you need, we're here to help get those codes into place and implemented and enforced correctly. So reach out if you have any questions as it relates to that as well. Okay, so most of you know about the Code Adoption Toolkit and all of the great resources that we have available on there. Significant changes, bunch of fact sheets, checklists, yep. Bunch of stuff that can be used for your jurisdiction or for your company to understand what's coming down the pipeline. But my favorite resource is the Codes Helpline. It is a great resource for anyone in the state of Colorado, and you can submit a question on any of the I codes or REACH codes or those state model codes coming down the pipeline, and a subject matter expert gets back to you within a couple days' time. So if you're a homeowner and you have a question on code applicability or engineer, or if you're a plan reviewer, for example, and you have a question on how to inspect or review for a specific code requirement, we're here to help. So it's just as simple as scanning that QR code, bookmarking that link, and submitting questions as they come up. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen, but just the last couple of items for housekeeping. Throughout the webinar, we want to encourage questions, so please use that Q&A function, or you can even raise your hand. And I will be letting Hope know about your questions throughout today's presentation, so we can address any questions that come up as they are brought to us. But following the webinar, there will be a survey window that pops up. So if you could please take a minute to provide that feedback, that really helps us to improve on these webinars and also pick upcoming training topics. Okay, I think that's all. Hope I will go ahead and pass it over to you, who is our presenter today.
All righty. And I believe I am sharing my screen. All right, well, hello everyone. How much fun do you think we're going to have today talking about residential existing buildings and how the new, revised, revamped section of Chapter 5 for the 2024 really does encompass a lot of the questions I think we have all been posing about how do we deal with existing buildings? Because, as many of you have heard from me before, we're trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and it doesn't always work. There's not always a one size fits all in how to address existing buildings. Now, what I will say is the 2024 Residential Consensus Committee actually created a separate subcommittee that did nothing but look at Chapter 5 to try to address some of the concerns. So obviously, we're going to take a look at what those were and see if we can navigate them together and have a little fun doing it. All right, let's see if we can get it to work. There we go. So our first section that we're going to look at is going to be, 501.2, which is dealing with compliance. And this is incredibly important because this really lets us know a little bit of the things that we need to take into account. For example, when we talk about existing buildings and they're doing some work on an existing building, and there's going to be some energy components that's with it, that doesn't trigger that the entirety of the building is going to have to be brought up to the code. What it's saying is the code is requiring that that portion of the building or system, which is incredibly important, it's not just a space, it's also systems that are included with it. And those parts that are not being touched don't have to comply. This section still deals with that concept of we want to ensure that you maintain the structure itself, keep the maintenance up on it. So maintenance does not trigger requirements of this code because how energy efficient is a furnace if you don't replace the filter? But in theory, you could interpret it that if I replace the filter, now all of a sudden I have to put in a new system and everything else. And that's what they're trying to allude to is that's not what we're talking about. Please change the air filter in your furnace. So basically, unless this chapter tells you that you are to do something different, you can't use this chapter as a way of making people bring the entirety of the project up to the addition of this code. All right. New and replacement materials. There's always, I see a couple of things here that just popped in. Oh, sorry. So they have always said that you can utilize, there we go, materials. They can be, you can use like for like when you're doing repairs. The caveat to all of this is basically if the code permits for this type of material to be utilized, then you can still continue to utilize it. You have to ensure, though, that it isn't something that's going to be a hazard to, health, safety, or the property. So even though you might have had asbestos insulation, it does say like for repairs at that point, you really wouldn't be able to go ahead and put back asbestos, right? You're going to want to do something different. So that's basically what this code is, or this section is trying to do is, yes, you can use, the same type of material as long as that material is not hazardous to the health, life, and property. But you cannot utilize hazardous material if it is not permitted by the energy code, which doesn't have a lot of hazardous materials necessarily included in it, but you would see, a hazardous materials out of the IBC and the IFC, and you say, hey, Hope, you just mentioned codes that would fall under commercial, but remember the residential energy code does pertain to R2s, R3s, and R4s. So they could be looking out of the IBC and the IFC for them. So that might be a location that if you saw hazardous materials that were listed there, they probably aren't going to allow them in a single family home either. All right. Here's where it gets to be a little bit fun. I get questions quite often when it comes to historic buildings and how do we address that? And so basically the breakdown of how historic buildings work is one, it has to qualify as being a historic building. Just because you have a structure that's old doesn't necessarily mean that it pertains and it qualifies as being a historic building. Now, when it comes to that, historic buildings typically might have a feature or a component of it that makes it that historic fabric of the building. And so there are times that you aren't able to alter them or bring them up to code because it destroys that historicalness of that structure. And so what this code does say is that's fine. We get it. We want to maintain the historical fabric of that particular structure. But in doing so, we'll say it's windows. You can't replace the windows, but hey, you can fill all the wall cavities with insulation. You can put some insulation in the ceiling. You can have your ductwork insulated. All those things can happen. But we're going to say hands off to the windows and we don't care. Now, to be able to qualify for that, there has to be a report that's provided, and it needs to be provided to the code official. And the person or persons that can provide a report to the code official is going to be that building owner, a registered design professional, a state historic preservation officer or from somebody from the office, and then a historic preservation authority having jurisdiction. So raise of hands, how many of you in your local jurisdiction have a historic preservation, a planner or somebody who ensures that we're maintaining our historicalness of our structure? So they would be ones that could qualify in providing a report to the code official, because often they're providing a report to the building owner, and a lot of times they're putting that in file. And so what you would do is you could accept that. So in this particular report, what it does have to contain is it does have to contain basically what provision was it that has a problem with complying with the energy code because of the historic nature of it. Oops. For some reason it doesn't want to switch slides. So we talked about how historic buildings kind of are dealt with when it comes to oh yes.
We got our first question.
Awesome. I love questions. What's our first one?
In converting a non-conditioned existing space to a low energy use space in a historic building, does the envelope of the reuse space need to meet new insulation values?
That is a very interesting suggestion or question. And basically what we would end up going to is, I believe it would be 502.1.6, which deals with a change in conditioned space, or the change in how a space is conditioned going from non to even to low. There may be some requirements for it. Now, bringing that back to where the historic building comes in, it would then it would kind of be dependent, right, on whether or not the insulation would affect what the historicness of the building. So if it was just across the board and it was just windows that were the issue, and you're increasing it from the non-conditioned to the low energy building, at that point, you're going to start following the requirements because it kicks you into the addition section. So then you would start following what is required per those sections, which we'll kind of get into. And And in those instances, it may require that you would have to have insulation. So while it is a very interesting question that I'm kind of mulling over in my brain a little bit about whether it would, because I mean, there is a section that does say for low energy buildings, but how chapter 5 is set up, it doesn't say you have to comply with all of section 4, right? Depending on whether you're an alteration or an addition or what have you, there are very specific sections that it states that you would have to comply with. And like I said, 502.1.6 does have some criteria in there for when you change from a non-conditioned space to a conditioned space. And it has nothing associated with it that I can think of about for low energy buildings. Pretty much, but we're going to get to that. And I'll tell you, when we get to those slides, my brain will probably be going a little bit in overdrive, trying to think about how it would apply to your particular question. So with that, we will move on. I haven't forgotten about it, but we're going to get to that here. So to ensure that we have historic buildings, we have to know how they happen to be defined. And so there is a definition about how buildings are, historic buildings are defined. So they have to be listed or certified as eligible for listings and in the state historic preservation office or the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places, the National Register of Historic Places. And then it also has, the second one is dealing with that it's been designated as historic under applicable law or local law, state law or local law. So this is one of those areas where it says, hey, it's not, I've had people say, well, it's not on the National Registry, but you can do it as a statewide law, or it can be something local. So for all of those that raise their hands, I'm assuming you probably have a historic district or something of that nature that you've overseen and is part of your community. And so those areas, if they are designated by your local law through your ordinance that these are historical areas, then they would be applicable to this particular one. And then the other one is if it's a contributing resource within a National Registry, state designated or local law historic district. So I always like to use the example of now the structure here, this old schoolhouse is a historic building. But the outhouse is not part of that building, but it does add to the historical, it's contributing to that historicalness. So that outhouse would be included with that schoolhouse. All right, so here's a question for you all. This is a 100-year-old building. Is this a historic building? How many of you say yes?
We're getting some no's in the chat. Some it could be.
It could be. All right. Well, actually, here's the really nice thing. Y'all are right, because it could be. It is 100 years old. It actually was 100+ years old before it was torn down. But yeah, it was 100+ years old, but it wasn't in a designated historic district, and it wasn't ever designated as a historic structure. So any type of construction that went on there, they would have to comply with what that exists or that historic, or I'm sorry, what the alteration requirements would be out of chapter 5. And they would not be able to be exempt out of something because they're quote unquote historic. All right. Here we go. This is for you, my question about historic and changing conditioning. So here we go. Now here's where it kind of gets a little, It says if a space or building is currently unconditioned or low energy and it's going to be conditioned, it has to be brought up to the full extent of the code out of 502, which is our additions. But what it doesn't say is if it's going from unconditioned to low energy, that you would have to bring that up. So that is something I think I might kind of look at. But the reality is, yeah, it tells you have to go into 502. So I would look at 502. If 502 doesn't trigger that particular section, it may have to increase its or provide insulation per what it says, which is basically, you know, fill the cavity. So it does have that, again, like I said, you have to comply then with section R502. 502 happens to be the section that deals with addition. So basically, in this sense, it says you have to be brought up to the full extent of the code. Now, there are some exceptions. It says you can utilize that simulated building performance compliance path that is in the 24 edition, which I'll say take a look at it before you might decide to go with this path. But it does allow you some leeway with it in the sense that you can be 10% worse than if you were a brand new building. Now, did it go? There we go. All right, so here's a garage. Well, there you go. So here we have a garage. So here's an example of what this is talking about. This is a garage that is unconditioned. Obviously, we can see everything's exposed. There's nothing going on within the structure itself here. And then they chose that they wanted to heat this structure. So what they would be responsible for is, in this instance, they have to bring it up to full code. We're talking about 2x4 walls all the way up to an R30. Is it plausible that they're going to be able to get an R30 in a 2x4 wall? Probably not. They're going to get close, maybe if they use closed cell spray foam, but they're not going to quite get there with that. But, you know, there's trading. There is some opportunities that they could do. Maybe they put in better roof insulation. Because in the 24, if we go look at that table for roof insulation, where in the 21 it was an R60, it was brought back down to an R49. So you could potentially, you know, do some trading there. There's no windows, as you can see. So trading of windows isn't really a possibility. And don't forget, when they do convert this, they still have to insulate that garage door. Now, there's not necessarily a number attached to it per the residential side of the code, but it does require that you would have to insulate, have some sort of insulation involved with it. So those are some of the things that you might look at if it's going from unconditioned to a conditioned space. Now, this is conditioned space and not converting it to a dwelling unit. That's a completely different section. So let's talk about 502 for additions. This applies to those new portions of a building. Now, when we talk about additions, it could be something like this pop top that we see on the screen down here, or an addition can be this additional mechanical equipment or lighting equipment, or service water heating system that's going in. It doesn't always have to be a, you know, square box that's getting attached. It could also be the systems that are included with it. Maybe an addition would be is they had heating, but they didn't have cooling. Now they're going to put in a new cooling system that's going to be full blown, right? It's going to have duct work and all of that is going in because they had radiant heat before. Now they want to have cooling. That would be considered a new addition. And that, or a new system, and that would have to follow 502. Does that make sense to everyone?
It does. I do have one question.
Okay.
Into the garage, before we dive too far into the additions. Are there not lesser restrictions for insulation values of a heated garage?
Yes, if you go into 513, there are some requirements. The requirement is, it does have to be thermally isolated from the rest of the dwelling unit if it's attached. But it can do where it's insulated to an R24 in the ceiling and an R13 in the walls. So there is that particular possibility as far as being able to comply with that. And if I would have to, when we go through and we look at the addition section, again, in this revised chapter 5, they really went through, because in the past it said, hey, if you touch it, bring it up to code. This time they made it very clear, and they really broke it out. Your thermal envelope, you will comply with X, Y, and Z. And so that's why I'm somewhat hesitant on giving you a specific answer, because I can't remember off the top of my head if that is the section that it does say it must comply with. But you are correct. There is that possibility, because R402 13 or 15, I can't remember, does deal with sunrooms and garages. All right. So with this one, yes, you have to do it as new construction, but you cannot have the addition that's going to create an unsafe condition, or that it's going to overload those existing systems, because a lot of times people will, they're going to do an addition and they say, hey, my existing equipment is going to go ahead and take care of this 1,000 square foot addition. That might be okay, but it might not be okay, because maybe that equipment had been sized for very specifically sized for the 2,000 square foot original portion of the house, and it never took into account that there might be $1,000 addition that, or 1,000 space or 1,000 square feet addition that's going to be included with it. So that's one of the areas that I think is incredibly important when we talk about additions, is ensuring that mechanical equipment, if they're going to use that existing equipment, can handle the additional load. And that's how we ensure that we are not creating unsafe conditions or overloading those existing mechanical equipment. So here's the section. Here we go. So it is a part here. So when you have a new thermal envelope, these are the very specific sections that you have to comply with when you are doing an addition. One is you have to comply with the general, which is 402.1, which does talk about the low energy buildings. So I believe that if you are converting to from unconditioned to low energy and you met the requirement of the 3.4 BTUs per hour, again, then you would not be required to do the insulation. If they exceed that, at that point, obviously, then they're not a low energy building, and you're going to comply with the 402.1 and all the specific information in here, including the insulation components. You also would have to take a look at, if we go all the way down here, hey, look, sunrooms and heated garages, their fenestration, you got to comply with 402.5. It also has the requirement for 402.2, which does have the insulation that's specific for garages and sunrooms. So they would do that 13 in the walls and the 24 in the ceiling. They could do that as long as, again, they're thermally isolated. Now, the one thing I want to bring to your attention that I say, probably, Erica, you probably get this question a lot. I get this question a lot. I see Robbie's in there. Robbie probably gets this question a lot. It talks about, for these additions, about air leakage testing. So this section does say you have to comply with R402.5, which is our air leakage section. But what it does say is you are exempt from section 402.5.1.2, which is your air leakage testing. So those are some things that you're going to take a look at for the thermal envelope. So insulation, air barriers, your thermally isolated sunrooms, and the testing, those are things that we pay attention to. Now, The next thing for the additions is your heating and cooling system. So it says you have to comply with 403 as if for all of those new systems or portions of a system, but it does have some exemptions for it, which is incredibly important, is for the duct work that's going from that existing system that you're extending into the addition. At that point, it says, hey, you don't have to comply with R403.3.7 and R403.3.8, which is telling you you don't have to do the duct system testing and the duct system leakage. 403.3.7 says, hey, you got to test your duct work. 0.8 is saying this is the leakage rates that you can get. Now for new service water heating systems, nothing changed in there. It's all the same. If you put it in, you comply with R403.5. And then our lighting systems, it's the same as it was before. New systems have to comply with section 404.1. Now, for additions.
Hey, hold one question before you jump into this slide.
Absolutely.
If one adds cooling to a garage, would R402.4.5 not apply then, and the higher values in table R402.1.2 or R402.1.3 apply?
Okay, so let me, I believe the question is, so basically what they're saying for those sunrooms and garages is if you're gonna do it and you're heating it, that the garages, the 402.212 doesn't apply, that then you're kicking into, you would use the full-blown energy code. Is that the question that, or am I understanding the question correctly?
Yeah, he gave the example of mini splits providing both heating and cooling and responded yes to your question.
Okay. So if you are taking, well, basically 402.2 kicks in when you're dealing with installing insulation and everything per what the table is asking for. And so, yeah, so if it's an enclosed conditioned space and heated garage, they don't have to go with the full blown of the code. They could still utilize 402.2.13 because that is a portion of, or that's what it calls out for if you're going to condition that sunroom, because otherwise that sunroom or that garage would not need to comply with the code because it's an unconditioned space, right? So if I get this to work, it seems like it stalls out every 2 seconds. So if it was going to be heated, it would trigger the fact that the thermal envelope would have to be kicked in, but it also says that you would have to comply with R402.2, and 402.2.13 is the section that allows you to do the 13 in the wall and the 24 in the ceiling. I don't know if that helps or not.
I'm going to hold on questions until the end now, just to make sure we get through all the content, if that's all right.
Nope, that's perfectly fine. I know we're kind of, it's a subject that everybody has questions about, and there's nothing wrong with that. All right, so let's talk about when you have an addition, you are required to then get and obtain 5 points from the additional efficiency credit requirements. Now, you would go into table R408.2. You can pick anything that you want in there that would be applicable for the climate zones, because not everything is applicable to all climate zones. But in the instance where you have an addition and you also have an alteration that's included with it, you still have to get that 5 points, but the alteration can help you get to be able to get to the 5 points for the addition. So it's not you get 5 for your addition, and you get 5 for the alteration, unless you fall under different parameters. But if you're just doing an alteration where maybe you're doing some increased, better U factor of windows or something, and you're putting that in here, then these could help you get the points for here too. It also has some exceptions to this. So additions that do not add a minimum of 25% of to the conditioned floor area. So if you have 100 square feet and you are only adding 24 square feet, this doesn't kick in. If you hit 25 to 100% of your conditioned floor space, at that point, this does kick in. It does not include when you are adding or replacing equipment, such as your heating and cooling appliances or your service water heating appliances. That doesn't trigger the requirement for the additional efficiencies. And if that addition doesn't have any conditioned space, then you don't have to get the points. And if you decide that your addition or the existing building and the addition, you're going to utilize that simulated building performance path, then you don't have to do the additional efficiency credits for it. All right. Now we're going to jump to alterations. So alterations, you do comply with this code as if it was new, but it's the portions that you're touching. So you can only require those items that are getting altered to comply with the code, not the items that are unaltered to comply with the code. Now, whenever you make an alteration, you cannot make it any less energy efficient than what it was before. And a great example for that is thinking about continuous insulation, right? Your alteration also cannot make an unsafe or hazardous for the occupants. You can't overload any existing systems. You also can't make the building use more energy than what it did prior to the alteration. So basically, it says you can't make it less energy efficient than what it was, but you also can't make it use more energy in the process for it too. And then for your alterations, you're going to comply with the various sections. So if we look at the building thermal envelope, the building thermal envelope just says you have to comply with R402. It says nothing else except for, you know, there are some exceptions to this, and we'll talk about that, but it just says you got to comply with 402. You cannot reduce the amount of R value for your existing insulation or increase the U factor of your thermal envelope because of that alteration. This is really important to understand. Now it does say if you use the simulated building performance path or the energy rating index, then you are exempt from that R value because you are at that point doing some trading. This is basically saying, hey, if you're going with the quote unquote prescriptive pathway with the existing building, then no, you cannot reduce or increase. Now there's some exceptions to these requirements. Now, if you recall in the past, there were quite a few exceptions. I think we were at 6 last go around. Now we're down to 4. The first one being is storm windows over existing fenestration. So if they have existing fenestration and they want to add storm windows to it, they do not have to make those storm windows meet the U factor out of the table. Now, this is very important. Roof recovers. Roof recovers are exempt. Roof recovers, as defined, is the process of adding another layer over an existing layer without removing that existing roof cover. So this is not replacing a roof. This is when we're just adding that second layer to the roof, then it's exempt. If you're putting you can put a surface applied window film on existing single pane fenestration. This has been in there forever. This is the idea to help reduce that solar heat gain coefficient from those single pane windows. Sometimes that might be a way of how historic buildings, historic windows are able to do something that's kind of like there. Well, we might be able to do this option. The last one is roof replacement. So where that roof assembly insulation is integral or located below the structural roof deck, it's exempt from having to comply with the roof insulation requirements. And this really stemmed because if you think about it, we've had a lot of questions, and we're not the only ones that have had a lot of questions. This gets beat up every cycle in there. And the idea is because it says, hey, if you remove that roofing, you have to install that insulation. This is now saying, okay, if you replace that roof and the insulation is integral or below, meaning it's part of that roof assembly, but it's not insulation entirely above roof deck, at that point, it's not triggering that you have to bring it up to code. If it's entirely above roof deck, then we're talking a different story. Fenestration alterations, of course, you got to meet the requirements out of the table. New fenestration has to meet 402.4. You still have the opportunity to utilize that area weighted average of the U factor and the solar heat gain coefficient. Now, this is where I think this is the most useful place for it, because there are sometimes in an alteration that maybe you have this type of window because unfortunately you can't get the window in the U factor that you need it to be because of its size or whatever the case may be. It's old, the style, whatever the case is, but you can get them with all of your other windows. Now you can take the area weighted average of those windows and demonstrate that you comply with the U factor and solar heat gain coefficient. I see this used a lot for alterations. Roof ceiling and attic alteration. So here's a very specific section dealing with the alterations. So your insulation has to comply with 402.1. That means you have the option that you can go with the U factor, the assembly approach. You can go with that R value option. You can also do res check when you're going through some of this. But if the existing conditions are not going to permit you to get to that full amount of insulation, then what you get to do is you're going to try to demonstrate and get as much insulation that is permitted for it. Then you have to provide what would be considered as the approved design. And basically what you're doing is you're demonstrating that, hey, this is an existing building. I can only get, it only has 12 inches. So I'm only able to get an R30 in there, but it didn't have insulation in there before, and we're getting an R30. I think that's a win-win for that. Now, it does say for the second one, so for roof replacements or alterations that include for that insulation above the roof deck, it limits the conditions for R2s to be able to utilize the approach of the approved design to limit the amount of the deviation that is permitted per the 402.1. Basically, because if it's going above roof deck here, the idea is you probably have a little bit more of a space-wise, but there are times where you have existing equipment that you might not be able to get that R49 in the location. So what this section is doing is really trying to maximize the ability to get as much insulation in that roof and ceiling, but understanding that, again, square peg, round hole. Above grade wall alterations, if the cavities are exposed, you have to fill the cavities. New cavities, new wall cavities have to go into the tables, 402.1 to determine it. It also still does reference vapor retarders, reminding you have to ensure that your above grade walls still comply with the requirements of a vapor retarder, because we don't want them working against each other. We want them working together. And exterior wall coverings and fenestrations are added or replaced when you have either the full project or at least basically one or more elevations, you will then be required to provide continuous insulation to the values that you find in the table. The continuous insulation has to work with the vapor retarder requirements of the IRC or the IBC. So whatever you are doing, whatever your assembly is for that, you would have to include that. I know this is one that probably everybody started throwing things at me when I said, hey, by the way, now you have to do continuous insulation when you do an alteration. Floor alteration, floor alterations. If you expose the cavity for that floor, you got to fill it up. And you have to install insulation in accordance to what 402 says. So that means things like ensuring that we've got an air barrier, that we have insulation in the configuration that's required, or you have an approved design. Because where the approved design concept is, and you'll see that in a lot of this now, is basically referring to that idea of, ooh, you know what? Square peg, round hole, what can we do to make it better? Below grade walls, comply and insulate it to the values that you see. If the space is conditioned and an alteration includes the thermal envelope, then it needs to comply with 402.1. So let's say you have a basement, right? And you are now going to finish that basement. If you have a basement, you're finishing it, you're not touching the walls, then the thermal envelope would not have to, or the walls wouldn't have to comply with it. Remember, it's just if you touch it, then you have to do it. Air barriers, air leakage, you are required to follow all of the components of dealing with air barrier. In this particular instance, it's saying that air barriers do not need to be continuous because wherever you are doing the alteration, let's say you have a bathroom you're doing an alteration in, they're going to require things like the air barrier behind the tub, the continuous air barrier that would be located for the exposed portion of the wall. So in theory, what you're going to have is a patchwork of air barriers that at some point may be a continuous air barrier, but they are saying you do have to install those air barriers and follow what the table says. You just don't have to open everything up to ensure that you have a continuous air barrier if it's not getting touched. And you don't have to do the testing for it. New systems, you're going to comply with 403 and 403.1.2. Remember, that's the section that said for ductwork that's extending from that existing systems. You still have to size the equipment. So you're going to do a manual J, a manual S, unless your existing equipment can demonstrate that it can handle the additional loads of what the alteration would be. So that kind of kicks in, you know, if it's an alteration where it was unconditioned going to conditioned, then you might have to do it. Now, alterations do not exclude you from having to perform duct leakage testing. What it does do is it gives you the opportunity to be a little bit leakier than if it was a brand new building, knowing that you are not going to necessarily have access to all of the ductwork in all of the spaces within there. So when it triggers is if you are relocating more 25% or more of the registers, you would have to do the testing. If 25% or more of the total duct length of all the ductwork is getting located. So it's not just, hey, I'm moving a register here to here, but now you're reconfiguring the duct layout, or the ductwork increases its total length by 25% of what the existing length was. At that point, you are then triggering that you're going to have to do the duct leakage, but you only have to meet the 12 CFM per 100 square feet of conditioned floor area, as opposed to the 3.0 or the 4.0 if it was a new building. It does say that, hey, you got to have controls for whatever type equipment is going to, new equipment that's going to be installed. So programmable thermostat, heat pump supplementary, hot water boiler, temperature reset controls. So those are all still required. This section really didn't change. Service hot water systems, if it's new, you have to comply with section 403.5, which is what you see on the screen, just as it pertains to it. Lighting systems for an alteration. This is where it's nice. It says, hey, new systems have to comply with 404.1 unless you're only replacing less than 10% of the luminaires in a space. So that means if I had a room with only one luminaire and I change it, then obviously I'm going to have to comply with it. But if it's a large room and I have 11 of them and I'm changing out one, I don't have to comply with 404.1. But whatever it is, we can't increase the amount of energy that's required for it. Now, this is where it does get a lot of fun. And you're like, Hope, you keep saying fun for additional efficiency credits. And I said, yes, because it is fun. All right, so our additional efficiency credits, when you do an alteration, you are required to get 3 credits if you are considered a substantial improvement. Substantial improvement, by definition, is when the cost of whatever it is you're doing, repair, construction, all of that, equals or is more than 50% of the market value of the structure before you did the improvement, you are then required to comply with the 3 credits. So it also says that where the structure has sustained substantial damage, I'll try talking today, as it's defined by the IBC, then any repairs are considered substantial improvement regardless of the actual repair work performed. So substantial improvement does not include the following: improvement of a building ordered by the code official to correct health, sanitary, or safety code violations, and alterations of an historic building. Well, the alteration will affect the designation as a historic building. Repairs. We just mentioned a little bit about repairs. This is fairly similar to what we've had in the past, right? You got to comply with this section in 501.3. 501.3 is talking about the maintenance section. So this is saying, hey, we want to maintain that this building and all of its systems are sanitary and safe. So we encourage that. We don't penalize you for that. Building owners and their agents are the ones that are responsible for this. Chapter 5 doesn't make reason for the removal or nullify energy, fire protection, safety systems, and devices that are located in this existing system. Remember, if it's there, we can't make them do anything with it. Now, 504 is the section that deals with repairs. And part of this says that part of these shall be repaired and they have to comply with 501.3. We just looked at that. It talked about maintenance, the building owner, and all that. You're going to work on the component that is needed for the repair, and that does not make it an alteration. So if you are trying to repair this pipe that got a pinhole in it, then we are going to say, yes, please remove that piece of pipe, repair it, and we're not making this, consider this to be an alteration. We want to ensure that, you know, regular maintenance and regular permits or repairs are done. Now, if it's a ordinary repair that's exempt from permit, then it's not required to comply with this section at all. So these are ones that are considered to be repairs: glass and replacements of fenestration, roof repairs, repairs of bulb, ballast, or both within existing, as long as it doesn't increase energy use. Now, here's a change of occupancy or use. If you're converting a space to a dwelling unit, this is what I was referring to before, from something else, you are required to comply with this chapter. And basically what it's telling you is now you have to do everything as if it was new construction. This isn't exactly new. You'll notice that not even the title is changed to blue. This is existing. So it says, hey, you're changing it to a dwelling unit. You're converting that garage because your kids came home and you're converting it now into their dwelling unit. then you're going to make sure that that dwelling unit complies with the full extent of what new construction would need to do. Now, there is an exemption saying, hey, I decided that I'm going to go with that total building, or I'm sorry, the simulated building performance. At that point, then you're allowed an extra 10% of worse than code of complying with it. It also has, what do you do with unconditioned space? So unconditioned or low energy spaces that then convert to conditioned space, you have to comply with 501.6, which we talked about. Change in space conditioning. So any unconditioned or low energy space that's altered to become a conditioned space is required to be brought into full compliance with 502. That's our addition section. And that one says basically, let's go with the full extent of what the code requires as if it was brand new. All right, I sped things up so we had time for questions. So Erica.
Awesome. Thank you, Hope. Okay, we've got some questions for you. Give me a second here. Get that up. Okay. Got a question. How do you document that you've made an addition or alteration that is not using more energy than the building did before?
Yes, so that's a really interesting concept. It's a very difficult one to be able to put an exact figure to it. The same requirement kicks in on the commercial side too, and that's a question that comes up all the time. I think you could use something that's called common sense, and it's not in the code, I know that, but they don't necessarily have set parameters. But I think if the space was not being utilized and it wasn't being conditioned and now it's being brought up and you have to demonstrate, or an alteration, and you need to show that it's not using more energy, and all of a sudden now it's going to be a dance studio in that basement, I think you could probably justify in saying, yeah, I think you're probably going to be utilizing a little bit more energy than it was before. But again, there isn't anything set in stone. I wish I had something for you. And sometimes I'm like, actually, it's kind of better to have a little bit of common sense there.
Allows for a little bit of flexibility, it sounds like.
It does. Gray sometimes is a beautiful color.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next one. Storm damage. Hail, for example, destroys exterior siding materials. Will replacement be required to add that exterior continuous insulation?
That is, you know what, that's a really good question, because how it reads, it's considered an alteration. Now, repairs in the past were considered, you needed to just bring it back to where it was before the damage happened. We would never, require, you have a fire, right? And you got a damage to a wall. Obviously, we want them to repair that damage. You know what? I'll be honest with you. I would have to look at that, because what it does say is it falls into the alteration section. So I don't know that I would call that as an alteration per se, because I think that still, in my opinion, counts as a repair. We want that building to function the way that it should be. So if we don't repair that siding for fear of putting on continuous insulation, we do more damage to that wall by allowing that moisture in and not having the correct system in place. So, yeah, these are all great questions. And here's the reality of it. This is one of the newer times, one of the first times of really diving into the new requirements of Chapter 5. And the problem or reality, and I'm not sure problem's the correct word, is we haven't implemented it yet and had enough, like, okay, so here's where we would draw the line exactly. And unfortunately, I hate kind of leaving it this way, but it's really a little bit of up in the air into getting further interpretations as to, how one would deal with that. To me, this is the world according to Hope. I would consider that a repair. Now, if it had insulation prior to the damage, that insulation is going back, no question about it. But I would consider it a repair, and I would want that siding to be repaired because I know how much damage that water can do to that assembly, and how good is wet insulation as far as energy efficiency, right? So, but that's just the world according to Hope. I suppose I should probably get a full interpretation
Well,
before.
it sounds like you're not the only one. We got some comments from some of the jurisdictions in the chat, and repairs and replacements are really kept separate, not considered to be alterations. So, as a home rule state, really lean on your jurisdictions there for some interpretation. Okay.
And I think a great way of handling that is maybe doing it as a policy. Hail damage falls under repairs. We want you to put it back the way it is. And then it's very cut and dry.
Yep, for sure. All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Took an extra minute of your time today, but thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If we didn't get to your questions today, feel free to submit those on the helpline, and I will assign those to Hope, so she will follow up. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I hope you all join us at the next session next week, next Wednesday. Okay. Have a good one.